Good morning, Bananamators. Today we're going to talk about dust. I do love dust. I've done some long videos on dust before where I just kind of ramble aimlessly around, but more specifically today we're going to talk about dissipation. So that's one of the things in special effects that really differs a lot from character animation. If you have a character, they're not going to disappear into some sort of amorphous cloud, and if they do, they send it to the effects department. So the character animators don't have to worry about it. If they get burnt to a cinder, I really love that trope where you just have character burnt up like this and then they turn into an ash pile and it's just like blink, blink. Hilarious. Every time. I love it. Okay, so dissipation. Basically, when we're doing effects, especially dust, I like doing dust for my dissipation because there's a lot of different options of which way it can be dissipated, and it's very forgiving, right? So here we can see I've just done a bunch of little directional dusts. So a dust getting scuffed up or kicked up from the ground. And there's a variety of different ways that they disappear, okay? They start somehow and they disappear somehow. This is the same for many types of effects. If you have a bubble sort of coming up from something, either it's coming out of like a tube and it's like bubbling along like this, or it starts out small and then the bubble grows. And then the bubble has its life and it shrinks to disappear, or it can pop. Like here, this would turn into a pop instead, and it disappears. Basically, you don't want anything to just jarringly appear on screen if you're watching a cartoon and then all of a sudden there's like a big dust cloud like this in the middle of the screen. It's going to look really abrasive and distracting. Dust is one of those things that are very subtle in animation. Most of the time you don't want to see it. The character is doing something cool, they're saving the day, and nobody wants to be like, ooh, look at that directional dust. Like, look at the dust that his feet are kicking up while he's literally strangling a dragon with his bare hands. So the best way to be unobtrusive is have it kind of show up in a very sensible way, not pop on in any sort of jarring way, and have it disappear in a gentle, unobtrusive way as well, right? So here's a variety of different ways that we see it done in different styles. We have the old school thing called the popcorn method. And yes, I'm repeating myself from my dust video, but bear with me. And you often see this in Warner Brothers, old Disney cartoons, things like this. You take your, whatever your dust starts out, and if it's getting kicked up from here, it would start out a little bit small, but because there's an action instigating it, it doesn't have to be a point, a single point. So our dust appears, it grows very fast, but then it dissipates somehow. In popcorn method, we take the big shape and then we start hacking it up into smaller shapes, and they change shape and get a bunch of extra little bits like this. And it's called the popcorn method because often it looks like a little popcorn kernel. This is pretty much popcorn right there. So we see lots of those little shapes appearing as it dissipates. It works really well in something that looks hand-drawn, the style of your show or your short or whatever it is project you're working on. If your stuff looks like it's been drawn by a human, then this type of dust works quite well. The main things you want to think about is volume. So one of the things I see often is we'll have a bunch of these circles and then it starts dissipating, and here this thing just disappears. So we don't want that to disappear. We want it to see how it's on the wrong layer. No. So we don't want it to completely disappear without any warning. We want it to gradually disappear so it doesn't steal any of the tension away from the main show, right? So often I'll see something like this, where one or more of them just go off in a completely cuckoo direction, right? These, you want to think about which way your dust is going. If your dust is getting kicked this way, you have to consider other forces. If there's wind, that's going to change the direction. For dust in particular, it is buoyant, so that means it floats. It's going to go up. For something like water, if it's getting kicked this way, gravity is going to take over and it's going to go like this. So you always think of the initial direction and then any opposing forces that are then added later. Effects animation is all follow through and overlap action. It's not the active thing like the character, it's the reactive thing like the hair and the clothes. It's just that there's no character. So when you're animating your character, if they're like standing in the breeze and there's wind coming this way, then you're going to animate your hair like a flag wave. That's special effects animation. It's just there's no character connected, right? This is now an actual flag. You just don't need the character. So we have to consider if it's buoyant, it's going to go up. If gravity is going to take over, it's going to go down. So you don't want anything to come off in a cuckoo direction. Draw some little lines for yourself. Just like we were animating across an arc like this for our ball coming towards our screen. Why wouldn't you do that for dust? And then just have your dust follow the little thing. It baffles me that people don't use arcs when they do effects. All animation uses arcs. All of it. Even this. Okay. So once you have this all working, you can take it and you can shade it. And again, we don't want anything to pop on in a very abrasive way. So here we have a little tiny bit of the thickness, and then the shadow grows and will get as big as it needs to match kind of the overall shading on your thing. But you don't want it to just show up or just disappear. So you'd go through and make sure all your little shadows are showing up in a non-abrasive way. And the best way to do it is just watch it a bunch of times. And there's no big, like if this was filled, even something small like this one here. See it? It's so distracting. So keeping your shadows coming in and coming out, like grading your thickness, have it start very thin, get thicker, and then go back out to thin again, is going to keep it from being distracted. All right, so that's popcorn. The next one is what I like to call the chew out method. In my other dust video, you heard me refer to this as the bro poof because it's often seen in games. So the more modern things that are very clean cut, this is the one we're talking about, things that look very vector, and it's a simple matter of the outside going much slower than the inside. So here, this line here, our leading edge, a very important thing to think about when you're doing special effects. The leading edge is slowing down significantly. And then in here, this is just going much faster, right? So people often overthink these things. You just have a little poof that shows up, and then it starts to gradually get slower, but the inside gets chewed out. So you could even finish the whole thing. Say you want to do it in 4 drawings, just do 4 slightly farther out, and then chew out that. You can hand draw it like this, or you can use your eraser, whatever one gets the job done faster. It's a little easier to have it follow along if you're looking at it. And then you can go as thin as you want with those final frames where it's chewed out. Usually these edges are very crisp. So this one's a little bit chewed out just because this one's a demo. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time making it crisp. But usually these edges would be quite sharp. The timing would be very, very clean, and it would just hollow out from the inside very smoothly. Here we have another example of that, where the inside is just going a little bit faster than the outside until it disappears. Another way is things just slam into place real big, and then they just are interpolated until they fade away. That's another thing that you'll see often in cartoons. Again, this one is more of a vector style cartoon, something that has very choppy timing. It's not going to look right next to a hand-drawn one, just like your popcorn dust's not going to look nice next to something very punchy and simple looking. It'll just feel wrong. And then sometimes we see the shapes just shrink. So I've been just playing with different shapes, but if we had something like this square, our squares would show up, they would grow onto the screen really quickly, and then they would shrink back down again. It's not common to see pure shrinking, 3 very simple shapes like this that grow and shrink. Usually you'd have a more complex shape, something that has a lot of edge texture, does really well by shrinking, and they just shrink the different shapes like this and separate them. So it does differ from popcorn, the shrinking, because they're keeping the shapes very, very similar. The shapes are just getting smaller. In the popcorn method, things can change shape quite drastically, and you're expecting for a boil. This is a little bit less boily because the shapes are staying more true to the previous shapes. So it doesn't boil, it just shrinks, but it would follow the direction. Something less likely to see would be this, but that's the basic principle of it, is all the shapes just shrink in size as they follow along the arc that they're going on. And then we get things like hybrids. So this is partially being chewed out, partially being broken up, partially being popcorned, and by using kind of a glom of different techniques, you can have something that is truly unique. And some people just do this really intuitively. They don't really think about the mechanics of it when they're doing it. They just do what feels right. And it will, usually you can break it into one of these categories. So you have popcorn, chew out, shrinky dink, and then fade. Doesn't really do anything. It just kind of grows and fades away. We see a lot of this in Kid Cosmic. They have like big booms and then it just fades away pretty quickly. There's not a lot of nonsense like this where you get really into little bits and pieces. I love doing bits and pieces. Something like The Last Kids on Earth, that one has a much more dynamic piecey dust that has a really long dissipate, really nice dust on that show. But generally, we're working with these categories. So this is the first place I would start if you were interested in special effects. First do the lines and the ball with the tail, the things that I've been doing the last couple of weeks. But once you want to get a little bit farther than that, this would be the next step that I would take, is to play with dissipating very simple dust. You can do it fairly quickly and you can play with a lot of different methods. Other effects dissipate differently as well. If you're looking at splashes, then your splashes start ripping apart and turning into water worms. One of my students called them worms, and I'm like, this is, yeah, water worms. I'm using this forever. I love it. So this is another form of dissipation. If we have a splash, even just a little impact splash or something where we just do a few little things like this coming off of something that's impacted, then these are going to shrink as they go because we don't want to deal with puddles. Puddles, just so much work to track puddles from scene to scene. Like, we don't have time to do that. So the way we combat it is by doing the shrinky dink on our water, just having it come down smaller. And then your little worms, they start to dissipate. You can think of them as like circles that have a little bit of water to stretch between them, because it's the surface tension of the water, like it wants to hold on to itself, that kind of does this. And the easiest way to do it is to track these circles. Once you get better and better at it, you're less tracking things very meticulously and you're more feeling and intuiting, but that doesn't happen when you start. You want to track some things, track a couple little circles like this, have them connected, and then eventually when they run out of stretch, they break apart, you can like fill in that volume with some little bloops if you want to and have everything shrink away. Another place where you see dissipation, of course, is fire. So you've got your pretty fire that you've worked out all meticulously. It's got all those little holes in it. It's got its internal thing. And then pieces are going to break off of it. So again, how are you going to dissipate it? Are you going to shrink it? So you've got a shape like this that stays the same shape and just gets smaller as it goes. It might follow a little path like this, so it's not too straight, but it'll just shrink away. Other places, you'll have the little pieces of fire that, you know, break up into sparks. Could go into many, many sparks. Who knows how they're feeling at the time. But there's basically just various pieces being broken off and then dissipating somehow, either shrinking, breaking apart, boiling away. There's something happening. So dissipation is one of those things that it's endless. I could come up with 7 million different ways to dissipate things because there's so many different shapes. Like I did some square dust, I did some kind of moony shaped dust, there's kidney shapes, there's popcorn shapes, and they could all dissipate in different ways. And it's really fun to explore, and this is where I like to start. Water to me is very hard. It has a lot more perspective that's gonna kick you in the face. So I like to start with dust. Unlike Joseph Gil-Antista, start with water. Start where you like. I don't know. But play with the different methods of dissipation and watch things for different kinds of dissipation. If you're watching magic, it's going to break apart in different ways. Old school Disney is going to break up in a different way than something like Teen Titans Go, which is very punchy. Some shows, everything dissipates into perfect little circles. You have to have circle on standby so you could have your circles just gradually shrink as they follow that path, and it has to be exactly little tiny circles. So annoying. I like popcorn because it's just a mess. You just boil the guts out of it, throw some blur on there, ready to rock. So just having your circle shrink, another way. Millions of ways. Do the ways. Look for the ways. One of the very first things to learn special effects is to start seeing how they're done and watching for dissipation. Watching for your waves, your wavy lines and stuff like that. That's going to be the first step. Once you see it and you see how they're doing it, then you can do it yourself. But before that, it's just, who knows? Who knows? All right. Like, share, subscribe, all those things internet people ask you to do. And I will see you in the next video.